Throughout the day, algorithms track our movements, purchases, and conversations, all to better serve us. We call this progress. But what if it's something else entirely? For centuries, the most terrifying visions of the future imagined a world consumed by war, famine, or disease. But history has shown that civilizations don't always collapse with a bang. Sometimes, they erode quietly, not through invasion or catastrophe, but through manipulation and compliance. This is what makes dystopia so dangerous. It doesn't always come dressed as tyranny. Sometimes, it arrives disguised as progress, convenience, or even happiness. And no two men explored this idea better than George Orwell and Aldous Huxley. As psychologist Carl Jung observed, every age has its own collective neurosis, and every age needs its own psychotherapy to cope with it. Our age is no exception. Orwell's 1984 imagined a future where people were crushed under an iron-fisted regime, a world of constant surveillance, censorship, and fear. The government didn't just control your actions, it controlled your thoughts, your language, your reality. Huxley's Brave New World, on the other hand, painted a far more seductive nightmare, a world where control wasn't enforced through fear, but through pleasure. People were distracted, drugged, and entertained to the point where they didn't need to be forced into submission. They simply chose it. But what if the greatest dystopian nightmare isn't one or the other, but a fusion of both? As cultural critic Neil Postman warned in his analysis, people will come to love their oppression, to adore the technologies that undo their capacities to think. If that's true, then we must ask, has dystopia already arrived? And if so, would we even recognize it? Throughout history, people have dreamed of building the perfect society, one without war, suffering, or injustice. The idea of utopia, a world where everything is harmonious and fair, has fascinated philosophers, political thinkers, and revolutionaries for centuries. Plato, in The Republic, envisioned a just society ruled by philosopher kings, leaders who would make decisions based on wisdom rather than personal gain. Centuries later, in 1516, Thomas More gave this idea a name, utopia, derived from Greek meaning no place, a subtle hint that such a perfect world might be impossible. But time and again, the pursuit of utopia has led to disaster. The French Revolution, the Soviet Union, and Maoist China all began with promises of equality and justice, yet ended in oppression, mass surveillance, and state terror. As American founding father Thomas Paine astutely noted, the greatest tyrannies are always perpetrated in the name of the noblest causes. Dystopian literature emerged as a response to the failures of utopian thinking, showing how societies striving for perfection can easily slip into oppression. Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels was one of the first major works to question utopian ideals. Swift imagined societies that, on the surface, seemed advanced, scientists and intellectuals ruling with logic and reason. But underneath, these societies were cold, detached, and cruel, sacrificing humanity in the name of progress. As the world entered the Industrial Revolution, dystopian fears only grew stronger. Machines promised efficiency and prosperity, but they also led to exploitation, child labor, and a new kind of servitude, one where humans were reduced to mere cogs in the machine. Johann Wolfgang von Goethe recognized this threat to freedom when he observed, "None are more hopelessly enslaved than those who falsely believe they are free." This insight would prove prophetic as technological and social control systems became increasingly sophisticated. By the 20th century, dystopias had become more relevant than ever. The rise of fascism and communism led to real-world horrors that seemed straight out of fiction. People were monitored, silenced, and controlled by regimes that claimed to act for the greater good. The Swiss psychologist Carl Jung, who lived through these dark periods, argued that our inability to deal with the forces of our own psyche poses the most significant threat to our civilization. In his work, The Symbolic Life, Jung wrote, "Indeed, it is becoming ever more obvious that it is not famine, not earthquakes, not microbes, not cancer, but man himself who is man's greatest danger to man, for the simple reason that there is no adequate protection against psychic epidemics, which are infinitely more devastating than the worst of natural catastrophes." It was against this backdrop that George Orwell and Aldous Huxley published their defining works, 1984 and Brave New World. These books weren't just stories. They were warnings about fundamentally different paths to unfreedom. As financial philosopher and risk analyst Nassim Nicholas Taleb observed, utopia is a mixture of all imaginable social experiments. Dystopia is what happens when those experiments fail. And today, we seem to be witnessing a new kind of failure, not just of Orwellian control or Huxleyan pleasure, but a hybrid system that incorporates the most effective elements of both. This hybrid system didn't emerge overnight. It evolved gradually as technologies of surveillance merged with technologies of entertainment, as governments learned from corporations how to manipulate desires, and as people willingly traded privacy for convenience. Imagine a world where people never question authority, never rebel, and never even feel the need to. Not because they are being watched or threatened, but because they are too entertained to care. A world where the greatest enemy of freedom is not a dictator, but comfort, convenience, and pleasure. This was the dystopia envisioned by Aldous Huxley in Brave New World, a world where people were not oppressed by fear, but by indulgence. As Huxley himself warned in Brave New World Revisited, a really efficient, totalitarian state would be one in which the all-powerful executive of political bosses and their army of managers control a population of slaves who do not have to be coerced because they love their servitude. Unlike Orwell's 1984, where people were kept in line through fear and punishment, Brave New World depicted a society where control was maintained through distraction and pleasure. Instead of banning books, the government ensured that no one wanted to read them. Instead of forcing obedience through violence, people were conditioned to accept their place in society with a smile. The most effective form of control in Huxley's world was pleasure. People were constantly kept in a state of artificial happiness, distracted by mindless entertainment, endless consumption, and a drug called Soma that erased any feelings of pain, sadness, or dissatisfaction. This vision is eerily reflected in our modern world. Today's digital landscape offers countless forms of Soma. Social media platforms are designed with the same principles used in gambling machines: variable rewards that trigger dopamine releases, creating powerful addiction cycles. Studies from the Addiction Center now recognize social media addiction as a behavioral disorder, with Americans checking their phones an average of 96 times daily, once every 10 minutes. Streaming services automatically play the next episode, while algorithm-driven content ensures we receive a constant flow of material tailored to confirm our existing beliefs and preferences. In 2023, Netflix reported that the average subscriber spends over 2 hours daily on the platform, more time than many people spend in face-to-face conversation. The ancient Roman satirist Juvenal recognized this strategy when he wrote, "Give them bread and circuses, and they will never revolt." Today's digital circuses are infinitely more sophisticated and personalized than anything the Romans could have imagined. One of the most concerning consequences of a pleasure-driven society is the decline of deep thinking. In Huxley's world, books existed, but no one cared to read them. Deep conversations were replaced by shallow distractions. The population was conditioned to avoid anything that required effort or introspection. Neil Postman expanded on this concern. The mindless entertainment industry has replaced the church, and addiction has replaced discipline. We see this reality in declining reading rates worldwide, with the National Endowment for the Arts reporting that less than 50% of American adults now read literature for pleasure, a record low. Meanwhile, TikTok users spend an average of 95 minutes per day on the platform, consuming content in 15 to 30-second increments. Complex ideas are increasingly compressed into simplistic formats. Twitter, now X, limits expression to 280 characters. Political debates are reduced to sound bites. Nuance disappears in favor of sensationalism. The result is a society that not only consumes shallow content, but begins to think in shallow ways. In his 1985 book, Amusing Ourselves to Death, Postman crystallized the difference between Huxley and Orwell. What Orwell feared were those who would ban books. What Huxley feared was that there would be no reason to ban a book, for there would be no one who wanted to read one. Orwell feared those who would deprive us of information. Huxley feared those who would give us so much that we would be reduced to passivity and egoism. The insidious genius of Huxley's vision is that, unlike in Orwell's world where rebellion is at least conceivable, a pleasure-driven dystopia makes rebellion seem pointless. Why fight the system when it gives you everything you think you want? But the prison of pleasure is only half the story. While we've been entertaining ourselves into submission, another form of control has quietly taken hold, one that George Orwell warned us about decades ago. Orwell's dystopia dominates through fear. It's a world where obedience is not optional, where every action, every word, and even every thought is controlled. Unlike Brave New World, where people are too entertained to rebel, in 1984, they fear the consequences too much to even consider it. If you want a picture of the future, imagine a boot stamping on a human face, forever, wrote Orwell in his chilling masterpiece. This stark image captured his vision of total control, a system that doesn't just want compliance, but demands complete surrender of the self. Many believe that the greatest dangers to freedom come from external threats, wars, invasions, or violent upheavals. But Orwell argued that the most effective control doesn't come from outside forces, but emerges from within the system itself. A government doesn't need physical chains if it can control perception. The cornerstone of Orwell's dystopia is surveillance. In 1984, Big Brother is always watching. Telescreens monitor every movement, facial expression, and conversation. The thought police can detect the slightest hint of dissent. Privacy doesn't exist. French philosopher Michel Foucault expanded on this concept in his analysis of the panopticon, a prison design where inmates never know when they're being watched, and therefore must act as if they're always under observation. The Big Brother state is always a step ahead of its citizens, Foucault noted. If you don't watch yourself, it will. Today's surveillance capabilities would astonish even Orwell. The average American is captured on CCTV approximately 75 times daily. Smartphones track location, conversations, and even health data. The Snowden revelations showed that intelligence agencies collect vast amounts of communications data. China's social credit system monitors citizen behavior in real time, rewarding compliance and punishing dissent. Beyond surveillance, Orwell identified language as a crucial tool of control. In 1984, the party creates Newspeak, a language designed to make thought crime impossible by eliminating words that could express dissent. If people lack words for concepts like freedom or rebellion, they cannot formulate these thoughts. The most effective way to destroy people is to deny and obliterate their own understanding of their history, wrote Orwell, recognizing that controlling the past allows control of the present. This manipulation of language and history is increasingly evident today. Modern information control operates differently than in Orwell's time. Rather than outright censorship, we see information drowning in a sea of misinformation, algorithmic filtering, and strategic amplification of certain viewpoints over others. Search engines and social media platforms determine what information reaches us, often without our awareness. Author Laurie Halse Anderson observed that censorship is the child of fear and the father of ignorance. In our digital age, this censorship is often invisible, not the banning of books, but the algorithmic burial of certain perspectives, creating filter bubbles where alternative viewpoints never penetrate. Perhaps the most psychologically powerful aspect of Orwell's dystopia is how fear becomes internalized. People don't just obey out of necessity, they learn to police themselves and others. As political philosopher Robert Anton Wilson noted, the obedient always think of themselves as virtuous rather than cowardly. In 1984, citizens engage in crime stop, the faculty of stopping short, as though by instinct, at the threshold of any dangerous thought. They practice doublethink, the ability to hold two contradictory beliefs simultaneously while believing both are true. These psychological mechanisms prevent rebellion before it can even be conceived. Today, we see similar self-policing behavior. A 2020 Cato Institute survey found that 62% of Americans say they have political views they're afraid to share, fearing social or professional consequences. As states of emergency become normalized, each crisis justifies expanded government powers and reduced civil liberties, powers that rarely recede completely when the crisis ends. The process accelerates with each new threat, whether real or manufactured. This gradual erosion of freedom was described by the Austrian psychologist Just Mirlu in his 1956 work, The Rape of the Mind. Each wave of terrorizing creates its effects more easily, after a breathing spell, than the one that preceded it because people are still disturbed by their previous experience. The genius of Orwell's insight was recognizing that physical oppression is inefficient compared to psychological control. When people believe resistance is not just futile, but unthinkable, the system becomes self-sustaining. Yet even this sophisticated system of fear-based control has limitations. People eventually recognize overt oppression and may eventually resist. That's why the most effective form of control might be one that combines Orwell's surveillance state with Huxley's pleasure state, a hybrid dystopia that watches us while entertaining us into submission. What happens when both forms of control exist simultaneously? Neil Postman recognized this dangerous convergence in Amusing Ourselves to Death. We now live in a time where Orwell's surveillance state operates alongside Huxley's pleasure-driven distractions. People are both watched and entertained, censored and pacified, controlled and yet convinced they are free. The result? A dystopia that does not feel like one. Sociologist Zygmunt Bauman, in his analysis of what he called liquid modernity, identified how control systems have evolved to become more fluid, adaptive, and difficult to resist. Unlike the rigid totalitarian systems of the 20th century, today's mechanisms of control blend seamlessly into everyday life, making them nearly invisible. Consider how information is managed in this hybrid system. In Orwell's world, information was tightly controlled, news was rewritten, history was erased, and the truth was whatever the party said it was. In Huxley's world, people were drowned in so much entertainment that they simply stopped caring about truth altogether. Today, we see both methods operating in tandem. The 2018 MIT study on Twitter found that false news spreads 6 times faster than true stories, creating an environment where misinformation flourishes. Meanwhile, important issues are buried under waves of meaningless distractions. Celebrity gossip, viral trends, and endless entertainment. The Reuters Institute found that while people have access to more information than ever before, they're increasingly uncertain about what to believe. This creates what researchers call truth fatigue, a state where people surrender the pursuit of objective truth and retreat into comfortable echo chambers. Those who still seek truth in this environment face a double challenge: navigating through misinformation, while also fighting the constant pull of distraction. Russian dissident and chess grandmaster Garry Kasparov observed this phenomenon during the rise of digital propaganda. The point of modern propaganda isn't only to misinform or push an agenda. It is to exhaust your critical thinking, to annihilate truth. Perhaps the most insidious aspect of this system is how surveillance has been transformed from an imposition to a convenience. Smart devices monitor conversations in our homes. Fitness trackers record biometric data. Social media platforms analyze emotional states and preferences. Each of these surveillance tools is packaged as a service, a convenience, a form of care. As technology ethics professor Shoshana Zuboff documented in The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, our most private experiences are now raw materials for behavioral prediction products. Cancel culture, public shaming, and viral outrage serve as decentralized enforcement mechanisms. This creates what communication researchers call a spiral of silence, where unpopular views are suppressed not by government censorship, but by social pressure. Political scientist Hannah Arendt warned that the most effective systems of control make people complicit in their own oppression. Today's social media platforms have created precisely this dynamic. Users police each other, report violations, and enforce conformity, all while generating data that strengthens the surveillance apparatus. The hybrid dystopia offers a perfect solution to the problem faced by previous systems of control: how to maintain power without appearing overtly oppressive. As Aldous Huxley predicted, the perfect dictatorship would have the appearance of democracy, but would essentially be a prison without walls. In this system, fear keeps people from questioning authority. Entertainment keeps people distracted from thinking. Technology personalizes control, shaping what people see, think, and how they behave. This is the ultimate nightmare: a society where control is so subtle, so ingrained, that no one even recognizes it. Orwell warned of a future where people were forced into submission. Huxley warned of a future where people chose it willingly. Today, we face a world that has mastered both. Modern authoritarian regimes like Singapore have pioneered models that blend consumerist freedoms with political restrictions. But what makes today's hybrid dystopia unique is its global reach, technological sophistication, and the way it has erased the distinction between the controllers and the controlled. The question remains: if this is the world we live in, is there a way out? Or is resistance futile in a system designed to make rebellion seem both impossible and undesirable? If the hybrid dystopia is so pervasive, why don't people resist? Why do so many not only accept this system, but actively defend it? The answer lies in psychological conditioning. Control is most effective when people willingly submit, when they internalize obedience so deeply that they no longer recognize their chains. Jean-Jacques Rousseau recognized this paradox centuries ago when he wrote, "The greatest enemy of freedom is a happy slave." Throughout history, rulers have relied on fear, manipulation, and psychological conditioning to maintain control. But in a hybrid dystopia, these methods have evolved to become more sophisticated and subtle. In the 1960s, psychologist Stanley Milgram conducted his famous obedience experiments at Yale University. Participants were instructed to deliver increasingly severe electric shocks to another person. Despite hearing screams of pain, about 65% of participants continued to the maximum voltage when the authority figure insisted they continue. Milgram's conclusion revealed a disturbing truth about human nature. Most people will obey authority, even if it means harming others, as long as the command comes from a legitimate source. They justify their actions by telling themselves that they are simply following orders, that the responsibility lies elsewhere. Consider how this applies to modern society. Government surveillance is accepted because it's for our safety. Censorship is tolerated because it's preventing misinformation. Public shaming is encouraged because it's framed as holding people accountable. A 2019 study in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology found that when authority is presented as caring, people are even more likely to comply with harmful directives than when authority is presented as strict. This compassionate authority effect explains why control presented as protection is particularly effective. Psychologists Martin Seligman and Stephen Meyer discovered the phenomenon called learned helplessness. When people repeatedly face situations where they have no control, they eventually stop trying to change their circumstances, even when opportunities for change appear. Perhaps the most disturbing reason people accept dystopia is that on some level, they want to. In Brave New World, citizens didn't fight for freedom because freedom implied responsibility, uncertainty, and potential suffering. They preferred comfort, even at the cost of autonomy. Developmental psychologist Robert Kegan observed that many adults never reach the stage of psychological development where they fully self-author their lives. Instead, they remain susceptible to socialized thinking, seeking approval and conformity over independent judgment. This psychological vulnerability is exploited in a hybrid dystopia. The system provides just enough comfort, entertainment, and social validation to make submission more appealing than resistance. Despite sophisticated psychological and technological mechanisms, history teaches us that no system of control is perfect or permanent. Even the most oppressive regimes have faced resistance and eventually collapsed. When tyranny becomes law, rebellion becomes duty, wrote Thomas Jefferson. But rebellion against the hybrid dystopia cannot rely on traditional revolutionary tactics. It requires first recognizing the invisible prison, then finding ways to create spaces of authentic freedom within and against it. Václav Havel, who lived under Soviet communist control before becoming president of Czechoslovakia, developed a powerful concept for resistance called parallel structures. Independent cultural initiatives, samizdat publications, and unofficial education networks that were more effective at undermining totalitarianism than direct political confrontation. They created spaces where people could experience genuine freedom despite the oppressive system surrounding them. In our digital hybrid dystopia, parallel structures take new forms, including alternative technology platforms, local community networks, independent media sources, and digital detox practices. Political anthropologist James C. Scott identified everyday forms of resistance, small-scale actions that ordinary people use to undermine systems of control without direct confrontation. Dutch psychiatrist Joost Meerloo suggested humor as a powerful antidote. We must learn to treat the demagogue and aspirant dictators in our midst with the weapon of ridicule. Another powerful resistance strategy is what philosopher Hannah Arendt called thinking without a banister, the capacity to judge situations based on independent reasoning rather than received ideology. Those who resisted totalitarianism were not necessarily the most educated or politically active, but those who maintained this capacity for independent judgment. The journey to freedom starts with recognizing the mechanisms of control. Social psychologist Robert Cialdini identified 6 key principles used to influence behavior: reciprocity, commitment consistency, social proof, authority, liking, and scarcity. Once recognized, their power diminishes. A practical first step is developing critical information consumption, the ability to question sources, identify manipulation, and seek diverse perspectives. Psychologist Daniel Kahneman's research on cognitive biases showed that we need structured practices to counter our psychological vulnerabilities, including deliberately seeking information that challenges existing beliefs and creating cognitive pauses before responding to triggering content. Beyond individual psychology, breaking free requires rebuilding authentic community. A 2019 study in Nature Communications found that strong social networks significantly reduce susceptibility to computational propaganda. People embedded in diverse, face-to-face communities are less likely to spread misinformation or fall victim to extremist ideologies. Technology ethicist Tristan Harris outlined specific strategies for reclaiming attention and agency, including turning off notifications, using browser extensions that remove addictive features, and scheduling specific times for digital access. From a psychological perspective, overcoming the pleasure principle requires what psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi called flow, engaging in challenging activities that require skill and concentration. Unlike passive entertainment, flow activities provide deeper satisfaction while building capabilities that support autonomy. Historical evidence from resistance movements shows that collective courage is more accessible than individual bravery. Political scientists Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stephan found that nonviolent movements requiring broad participation have been more successful than violent resistance led by the few. As Albert Camus wrote, "The only way to deal with an unfree world is to become so absolutely free that your very existence is an act of rebellion." In the context of the hybrid dystopia, This means consciously rejecting both the fear-based control of Orwell and the pleasure-based manipulation of Huxley, choosing, instead, to live with awareness, intention, and connection to real human values.